Judgment Day in Korea. The Constitutional Court rules on the impeachment of President Yoon. Next up on the impossible state.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become the United States' top national security priority. Each week on this show, we'll talk with the people who know the most about North Korea.
Welcome, everyone, to a special episode of the Impossible State podcast. I'm your host, Victor Cha, President of Geopolitics and Foreign Policy and Korea Chair at CSIS and Professor at Georgetown University. Only a few hours ago, the Constitutional Court in Korea ruled and made the decision to uphold the impeachment of President Yoon from the presidential office in Korea. So as we speak now, they are taking down pictures of the president in Korea, and everybody is preparing for the next step, which is the presidential election that will take place in June. We're having a special session of the Impossible State podcast to bring you live analysis of what has happened in Korea with 3 very wonderful experts who have agreed to join us here in the studio in DC and CSIS. None of whom are a stranger to the Impossible State podcast, I should say. First, Yoojin Kim is the Washington correspondent for Kyunghyang Daily News. Also with us is Dr. Darcie Draudt-Véjares, who is a fellow of Korean Studies in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Dr. Andrew Yeo, who is the Korea Foundation chair, Korea Foundation chair at the Brookings Institution and professor of politics at Catholic University. So thank you all for joining on short notice. Thank you all for joining us today for our conversation about what happened in Korea yesterday evening. So just for those of you who are focused on reciprocal tariffs or other sorts of things, what happened in Korea last night was that after 4.5 months, a decision was made by the Constitutional Court of Korea to uphold the impeachment of President Yoon and remove him from office. This ends about 18 plus weeks of political uncertainty in Korea. And I think it's pretty fair to say that none of us really knew what the outcome would be. And all of us were probably glued to our phones, our televisions, whatever it was at 10 p.m. Eastern last night to watch this, watch this 20-minute, basically I think it was a 20-minute reading of the charges and then the verdict at the very end. So I think maybe if we could start by just getting all of you to reflect a little bit on like what you thought the minute you heard the decision by the court. Like how did you think about it? What was your reflection on it? Did you feel a sense of relief, anxiety, disappointment, exhilaration? Like what did you actually feel with regard to this? Let's start with Yoojin.
Yeah, so definitely relief. And I guess a lot of people expected it because it was so clear that he violated Constitution and there were grave violations of law. But because the decision was a little bit delayed compared to people's expectations, maybe it came as a delightful surprise for many of them.
Yeah, because in the past 2 cases where the court had to deliberate on an impeachment decision, they acted fairly quickly. Right, but this one took quite some time. Andrew, what about you? How did you think about this?
Same thing. I mean, a collective sigh of relief. I mean, cheers for at least for half the country in South Korea. But I think what really struck me was that the court decided this unanimously. It was 8-0, because there was a couple weeks delay. We expected the ruling to come earlier. There was discussion that perhaps there might be dissent, or they were trying to marshal the statements together so that there wouldn't be as much division. But the fact that it was 8-0, I mean, I think that really helped. I think that really helped keep the calm and the peace afterwards. So there's thoughts that conservatives might react violently, but I mean, this was definitive. So so again, a collective sigh of relief for the country.
Yeah. Darcie.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, in Washington here for the past several months since the martial law declaration and the impeachment trial, I think that we've been assuming that it would be upheld, but the length of it really did kind of like have this lingering sense of maybe they couldn't get all the votes. And then there were certainly some contrarians around us who were putting some theories about why that might have been the case. It was a split vote. The political pressure, particularly on the right, was getting too hard. I think for me, I was most worried about what would happen when the reading of the decision on the ground. I mean, I wasn't here there this time for these protests, but I've seen firsthand protests in Korea in the past, and I know that they are really just so vibrant, and people are so impassioned about it. So I was worried about what that would be like, because there is, and we'll probably get into this more, is what does the lingering polarization mean? That's not going to go away. So I think for me, it's what's next.
Yeah.
How do we go forward from the polarization that was even exacerbated just by the length of this process?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the 8-0 court decision, I mean, we remember that during this long delayed process, there was also a lot of maneuvering to try to get the ninth judge appointed, right? And then the government was resisting. But if you look at those 8 judges, 6 of them were appointed either by Yoon or by the interim government, right? 6 of the 8. Only 2 of them were appointed by Moon, I think, if I have that right. And in spite of that, it was like 8-0, right? An 8-0 decision, which really speaks to the definitiveness of the decision. And as you said, like, people were uncertain. There were all sorts of theories out there because, Han Duck-soo was reinstated, and then Yoon was released from detention. So people really didn't know. And in the end, this decision was important. So in terms of the reactions, maybe we could talk a little bit about the reactions from both the conservative and progressive sides with regard to the decision. What were sort of some of the things that you noticed? Are you worried that pro-Yoon protesters, they've been pretty vibrant was the word that you used, but in some cases also violent.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think is going to happen there? Let's start with Darcie.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a force that's been unleashed. I mean, and this is something I was speaking on another panel a couple weeks ago about the state of elections globally. And what became remarkable, and Korea is no exception to this, is that the fact that seeds of doubt in the institution of elections, that's a really big part of the claims around the pro-Yoon supporters. That's going to be something that I think is going to not be going away, and is something that the Conservative Party can latch onto in the next 60 days as part of the election. That's the problem with doubts about the legitimacy of elections or election trust. It's something that's hard to combat, right?
Yeah.
Those doubts, those conspiracy theories. And so I think that's something that's not going away, particularly given that community is empowered by social media in South Korea, particularly on YouTube. And this is a really powerful force that is going to be a really central part of the election going forward.
Yeah.
Well,
Andrew.
the concern on the conservatives was because I don't know if it was late January, early February, we saw scenes of violence at the courthouse when Yoon was arrested. They smashed windows. They stormed into the courthouse. And so there were concerns that if Yoon is impeached, that we would have a repeat of the incident. Now, the government, South Korean government, they took a lot of steps to ensure that they could keep the peace. There was 14,000 riot police that were dispatched to Gwanghwamun in central Seoul. But I think it helped that acting president, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo came out asking for calm. He had a very measured response about the court's decision. President Yoon also didn't fight, maybe the lawyers may come. There's not really anything they can do at this point, and there's still criminal charges that he has to face. But he also accepted the decision, and so hopefully that will diffuse at least the violent angst that may have been penting up among some of the conservatives. I will say, though, that in the election, between now and when elections are held, we will see, I still think, a strong force of protesters, conservative protesters on the streets. There's one pastor, a right-wing pastor, Chun Kwang-un, who said that we should fight this, and so he'll rally his supporters. But this is mostly from a far-right party, the Liberty Korea Party, and not necessarily the PPP, the main conservative party.
Yeah. Yoojin, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so it was fortunate that we didn't have serious clashes between the protesters, like anti-pro impeachment protesters, and also police. And although they are the supporters of Yoon are vowing that they are gonna come out to streets again to sort of rally support for Yoon. I wonder whether that momentum will still hold. So I think we'll have to see. But Yoon, while he said his public message was that he was sorry and thank you to supporters, but he did not really explicitly say that he accept the decision and he made an apology. He didn't make an apology. So we'll have to see because there are a lot of procedures that the dismissed president has to follow, that he has to vacate his residency and everything, but it hasn't happened yet. So there are still a lot of uncertainty left.
And he has a criminal court case coming
Yep,
up as
yep.
well in a couple of weeks too, right? Yeah. Anyway, as you all said, this decision has ended 18 plus weeks of one phase of this political crisis that has engulfed Korea. We now move to the next phase, which is, of course, 60 days before the election. Did they say what the date of the election is now? Is it June 3rd or 4th? Or
Well, they're speculating June 3rd, but I think until the acting president announces elections, it's 60 days from that point. But
see.
I think a lot of people are thinking June 3rd because the decision came out on
Yeah,
April 3rd.
yeah. So that's where it moves to. A lot of the energy, all the energy that was in the streets focused on the court decision, will now move to this election campaign. Of course, this is not the first time we went through this once before. 60-day snap election. What do you think are going to be? We can talk about the candidates in a minute, but what do you think are going to be sort of the major issues as we move in this direction? Start with Yoojin. What are like the major issues you see in this campaign coming up?
Yeah, so I guess the challenge faced by PPP is surmountable. And first, they have to distance from Yoon and re-strategize how they're going to prepare for the elections and also rebuild the conservative base. But given a short time frame, it's going to be challenging for them. And I think yesterday's conference of PPP lawmakers, it basically was more of a blaming game between lawmakers, like a fraction of lawmakers who supported impeachment votes. So we can expect a lot of infighting happening, and then it will escalate, which would also be a challenge for the PPP. And they have to come up with a strong candidate as opposed to Democratic Party, which already has a obvious frontrunner.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it must have been, I mean, to what extent, it must have been a dilemma, because on the one hand, they should have been organizing to think about this this possible eventuality. On the other hand, it would have been a huge vote of non-confidence in their incumbent president if they were doing something like that. So they're kind of caught flat on their feet. I want to ask Andrew and Darcie, like, I feel like, in past elections in Korea, the U.S.-Korea alliance is never an issue. Like, it's never really an issue. Generally, support is pretty high for the alliance. But I would imagine that one question that Mr. Lee, as well as whoever the PP candidate is going to get, is like, what are you going to do about all these tariffs? Like, I just have a feel like I would imagine, because these are now mounting up to be significant tariffs against South Korea, like significant. So I don't know whether you have thoughts on that or what other issues you think will be important for the two candidates to wrestle with going forward.
Yoojin talked a little bit about election strategy, but in terms of the broader issues, I mean, I had thought of three. The first is a message of national unity. I think whoever the candidate is for the PPP, or Lee Jae-myung, they want to see that now that the court decision has been decided, we want to move forward and we need to bring the country together. So that's the general message. Although it sounds like from Yoojin with the PPP, if they can't even decide among themselves and find unity there, they may have a slow start on that message. The second is, of course, the economy. Growth was already projected to be slower, and now that Trump has brought on these tariffs against Korea and other countries, that's going to have a massive effect, I think. On the economy in terms of even job prospects, in terms of decisions on how the country is going to engage the United States. And then the third which is related, is U.S.-Korea relations, foreign policy, but U.S.-Korea relations in particular. There hasn't been a political figure leader that has been able to meet Trump because of the political crisis. And they're going to have to figure out, what do we do with, as you mentioned, what do we do with these tariffs? On one hand, I do think Lee Jae-myung has moderated his positions about the United States, and so he may still want to sustain the alliance relationship. But because of the tariffs, if there's a feeling building up in South Korea that, well, we can't just stand here and sit aside, that he may feel more pressure to actually confront the U.S. and maybe even talk about retaliatory tariffs. And of course, that could really boost tension. So that's something that he has to consider. But I do think with the economy, the tariffs, how you're going to deal with the U.S., that's going to be a major issue that either a progressive or conservative candidate will have to deal with.
Yeah. Let me ask you, Darcie. So if we pick up from what Andrew said, so, I mean, again, if we think about it, they're the reciprocal tariffs, 25%, the steel and aluminum tariffs, 25%, foreign auto tariffs, right, 25%, and then the Mexico tariffs. And I don't know if there's a 10% base tariff in there somewhere that Trump talked about, although we all saw the formula for how they came up with that, which is pretty, all right. But, like, so you have all of that. We have 2 more months. Yeah. And then who knows, like, in those 2 months, Trump may all of a sudden come back to SMA and say, I want $10 billion, I want cost plus 50, right? Cost of U.S. forces plus 50%. Like, how is something like that going to affect the way America is talked about in this election campaign?
Yeah, it feels like such a different moment than previous elections where the alliance was politicized, but in different ways, particularly among the progressives who have traditionally sought a more autonomy versus the alliance. But this time around, I think that we're seeing something really quite different for a variety of reasons, not least of which Lee Jae-myung is a bit of an outsider to the traditional progressive establishment. We can talk a little bit more about what that means, particularly with the alliance. But I also think that it means, we're also in a moment where the South Korean public, Trump aside, the South Korean public still has a really high attitude toward the United States, both as a people and as their security guarantor, like the alliance itself in particular.
Yeah,
it's like 80-something percent, and this is something that's consistent along party line, among the public, right? So that's necessarily changing the nature of how that's going to be become a partisan issue this time around the election. And I think that one of the big, the 2 structural factors is I don't want to get too much into geopolitics, but North Korea's retreat and the China factor, namely the economic coercion that it did in the late 2010s after the THAAD deployment, that changed a lot of the ways that Korean people and policymakers saw the role of China in its economy, right? And now we've seen over the past few years in Trump 1 and in the Biden administration, South Korea companies and the administration turn more toward the United States. And so we see this in investment practices over the past 5 years. I'm tracking a lot of this in the research I'm doing for my book right now on Korean industrial policy. So I don't want to get too far in the weeds. I could easily do that. But all of this is to say that I think that right now we're in a moment where U.S. relations as it pertains to the economy is actually quite different than previous elections. It's not seen where we need China for the economy and the United States for our security in the same way. But the Trump factor is kind of like, is the wild card in all of this, and the tariffs are too, right? So I think that what this means, and we've seen, Lee Jae-myung tacking more centrist, particularly as it pertains to the alliance. He's, backed off some of his more conciliatory statements on China. And I think that this is because the public sees the United States as their economic and security feature. And I think at the end of the day, Lee Jae-myung is a politician, right? More than, he's not really part of the progressive establishment. So that's how I think that issue is going to be playing out quite differently than previous elections.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit. Let's talk about Lee Jae-myung. Let's talk a little bit about him. As Darcie said, lately, he's been, I think in Korea they call it right-clicking, right? He's been sort of tacking more to the center. He did the interview with our good friend Michelle Lee at the Washington Post, really sort of moderating the views on Japan, right? Did also with Noah Snyder at The Economist and a few other places. There were actually some DPK lawmakers who were in town like early in the new year, and they clearly tried to send the message that, like, hey, that first impeachment motion that had stuff about Japan in there? They're like, that wasn't us, right? That was like the splinter party. That was not. They were clearly there to send that message. So Lee Jae-myung, he is So is he Moon Jae-in? Is he Roh Moo-hyun? Or is he, as Darcie said, is he a politician through and through who just through the constellation of forces happened to end up with the DPK? And then if that's the case, like how much can he be independent from, the progressive base within the DPK?
Yeah, so people who are familiar with Jae-myung say that he is a pragmatic politician and he's flexible, and that can actually be opportunistic at the same time. And he has political and administrative experience running a local government, being a mayor. And in that position, he actually pushed forward some bold policy ideas. So he has this reputation of getting job done. But then I guess just like Yoon, he's not experienced in foreign policy or diplomacy. And I think a lot of his foreign policy orientation may be actually influenced by domestic political calculations. So we'll have to see how his stance towards North Korea, China, Japan, and also US will be like. And like one of the, I guess, in terms of leadership style, there are some elements of concerns for Lee Jae-myung because he has been less tolerable for criticism within even from his own party. So he's not like a unifier figure, which Andrew just spoke that national unity should be a really important message, especially when we have this whole political turmoil and snap election. But he's more of a fighter, I guess, even within his own party. So we'll have to see how it's going to play out, whether he's going to be really able to garner support, because I feel that it's really important to have a strong domestic base vis-a-vis Trump, especially when we were trying to negotiate tariff terms. So, yeah.
And then what about so we have a handful of potential candidates on the PPP side, all of who are polling in the single digits. Like, do you have any thoughts on them? Kim Won-soo, Oh Se-hun, Hong Jin-pyo. I'm probably missing some, but any thoughts on any of those? I mean, anything that stands out to you about any of those?
So far, Kim Moon-soo, who is more on the far right side, ultra conservative, he has really been polling well at about 10%.
Oh, okay.
But election, just like in the US, is really you have to win over the centrist voters, independent voters who don't really identify with their political parties. So I tend to think that more of a centrist candidate will have a chance of winning the general election. But in terms of party primaries, I'm not so sure, because while we were going through this political crisis, a lot of, as Darcie mentioned, ultra-right voices, they really gained traction. So, and PPP was sort of not really clearly drawing line from condemning the martial law declaration as it unfolded. So, it's very much unclear at the moment, I think, in terms of who's going to be the candidate at the PPP.
Yeah. Andrew, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, first on Lee Jae-myung, I think, you just did a great job explaining some of his background, but I guess the 800-pound gorilla in the room is that he's also a tainted candidate in some ways, because he has a lot of political legal baggage that's hanging over his head. Of course, he was acquitted of the most recent charge, which allows him to now run for president without being delayed. There was a charge about election related to election irregularities or fraud that if he had been convicted, he would have possibly not been able to run as president. But there are other cases where there's a real estate scandal when he was a mayor. There's a scandal where he sent money to North Korea, and you could say that these were politically motivated charges against him. But either way, that that signals to ordinary Koreans but this is someone who seems to have a pattern here, that he's willing to kind of abuse his position or his office to make things go his way. Is that the sort of candidate you want? Because that was the criticism of President Yoon, that he kind of does things his way without really listening. So that's why I think there's a lot of reservations, even though he's clearly the front runner if there was an election today. I was just looking at some recent Gallup Korea poll, and it said that only 38% of South Koreans, or 38% of South Korean voters had no preference for a candidate. So that leaves a lot of room in the middle. And that's why I want to say it's not, Lee Jae-myung is not a shoo-in to be president, because there is some contestation in the middle. And so when I was in Korea in January, I remember talking with a few National Assembly lawmakers, and they actually wanted Lee Jae-myung to run because they felt that because he has a lot of political baggage, that they would fare better against him than another candidate. But it means for the conservatives that they also have to run someone that can capture the centrist votes. The 38% of people who are not sure who they want to vote for, because if they choose someone who's more right-leaning, they're only going to get maybe 30% of the votes of the conservative voters. But if they choose someone who's in the middle, more of a middle-of-the-road candidate, well, they'll get certainly the conservatives are not going to vote for Lee Jae-myung, even if they don't like a centrist PPP candidate. They're most likely going to vote for him, and that centrist candidate could pick up some of the undecided voters. And so that's probably the best election strategy for the PPP. But the PPP have to get their house in order and figure out who they want to run. And so there probably will be some politicking and infighting within the Conservative Party.
Yeah, I mean, Darcie, when we look at, like, we talk about this 38% like undecided vote in Korea, which basically means like every president, if they're lucky, basically has maybe 1/3 of the electorate that's their base, and the rest of the people are ready to leave that president as soon as they do something wrong.
Yeah.
Plus the fact that they have only one 5-year term.
Yeah.
Like, it's no wonder these presidents all flame out at the end of their time in office. I mean, it's almost like the electorate and the structure is set up in such a way that Korean presidents are going to fail in their last 2 years in office, or in this case, in their first 2 years in office. But so any thoughts on that? And also your thoughts on Lee Jae-myung and then the PPP, this mix of people that we've been talking about.
Yeah. I mean, in some respects, like as Andrew laid out, like it feels actually kind of similar to the last election where it was like it's the choice. It was framed as the choice of two worst choices, two unlikable, right? I mean, Lee Jae-myung lost to Yoon Suk Yeol by less than a percentage of a point, right? So in a sense, like it feels like a repetition of that. The other thing that I like to point to is that this is also kind of characteristic of Korea's party system, which is a really weak party system. Yeah. And there's this tendency historically since democratization for the party to, there's a corruption scandal or there's some, the president loses, or the party loses in a presidential election, the party dissolves, reorganizes around a next charismatic leader, right? And this has been the tendency this time. So in that sense, this time around, it's a bit different for the conservatives because they rallied around Yoon. Most of them rallied around Yoon to support him being reinstated. And that's different than, I pulled up this morning, the Gallup Korea opinion polls from 2017 during the Park Geun-hye impeachment case, and it kind of told a bit of a different story. I mean, on the progressive side, by and large, they supported impeachment. And that shouldn't be a surprise because both presidents at the time, were conservatives. Right. But there was a substantial gap in both the centrist and the progressives, the conservatives. So that time around, it was like 20%, it was a 20% gap between the centrists who supported impeachment, more so that time around impeachment than this time around, right? So there's fewer people, that would have been swayed. And then for the conservatives, it's actually more like a 30% gap. Right, so we saw, this time around, it's 30% or 50% of conservative Koreans are supporting reinstating Yoon, but that time around it was like 20%, 22%, I think precisely. Yeah. And so that's a really big different story because it shows that they were not just rallying around the PPP leader, but Yoon, this charismatic outsider, whatever, he plays by his own rules in particular. And given the lay of the land and the conservatives, we don't have a sense of, is it going to be Kim Moon-soo? He's not really the same charismatic leader type, right? This time around, like Oh Se-hoon does have, I think, a certain like gravitas among the right, like the far right in particular. He's a Seoul mayor, so like that is also, traditionally a launching point, that leadership role. So for the for the conservatives this time around, it definitely is like the fight for a charismatic or celebrity candidate. Like Lee Jae-myung is, he comes with tons of baggage, but that celebrity that he has still carries a lot of weight, I think.
Yeah. On the legal baggage stuff with Lee, I mean, maybe you can tell us, Yoojin. So at least from what I've read, the timing of those cases don't look like they could disrupt his run for the presidency. So he's basically cleared to run.
That's right.
For the presidency. Yeah, interesting. So all right. So we've talked about the campaign. We've talked about the candidates. June 3rd, June 4th, we have the election. Right. We have a new president of Korea. Like, what do they need to do? Like, what is on their to-do list? Going forward after what will then be like 6 months of the political of the government in Korea being basically in neutral, right? So, Darcie, like, what's on that list of things?
I mean, I'll echo exactly what Andrew said before. It's to have a message of national unity. I mean, there is a risk that like flaming the fans of polarization is a political strategy, but this is time and time again coming up in Korean politics, and particularly, I mean, part of the reason we got here was, protracted stasis in the National Assembly that was because of partisan divides. And so, if the next president wants to be an effective leader and avoid that sort of conflict in the National Assembly and the populace at large, that's the number one thing. And then the number two thing, I think, is going to be what we already talked about, working on the economic component of the U.S.-ROC alliance. I think is or the U.S.-ROC relationship in particular is going to be the next one, because these tariffs are going to be, a huge damper on the Korean economy.
Yeah, and we'll probably by June we'll probably be seeing the effects of that.
Yeah.
Oh, totally.
Almost certainly by June.
Yeah.
I mean, Andrew, what do you think? I mean, and to Darcie's first point, I mean, and Yoojin, the same question to you. Like, is there anyone capable in the Korean political system to credibly convey a message of national unity? Because I kind of think what you suggested is right. This campaign is going to be about doubling down, right? It's going to be about us against them and doubling down. It's not going to really be about let me be your unifying candidate, because nobody believes that these are unifying candidates. Like Kim Moon-soo, a unifying candidate.
Right.
Lee Jae-myung, a unifying candidate. Like, I don't really see it. But
Earlier, I thought maybe Oh Se-hoon, the mayor of Seoul, might be better seen as a unifying candidate just because he was quite popular. This is his second stint running as mayor. And because he was, he wasn't part of the party apparatus that was necessarily supporting Yoon. So he had enough distance from Yoon that maybe he could do it. But then I knew early on, though, that he was actually trying to align himself with Yoon more closely, and so that may not work. But you're right. I think a candidate, the way Korean politics works, it's often driven by personalities. And I know right now I said Korea's sighing, or at least half the country sighing a collective relief. Well, I actually think the majority of the country is sighing a collective relief because the political crisis is over and they can now move forward. And many, again, like CNN, I was just listening to a clip, they were hailing this again as a sign of democracy functioning as it should. The National Assembly, the courts, they all played a role in helping South Korea navigate this political crisis. But look, first, 2 impeachments in 8 years doesn't sound all that normal. And then second, in some ways, I think that this may have deepened political polarization. Totally. And so as much as I think actually a strategy is to find someone who can capture the middle votes, but the way primaries work in the PPP, and Lee Jae-myung's not going to, I mean, he's clearly going to be the Democratic Party candidate, in part because he purged all the other former progressives that were aligned with the Moon Jae-in faction and others. So he's not of that mold or of that progressive lineage. It's going to be Lee Jae-myung and then whoever the PPP decides. Going back to your question about what happens as soon as the next president is elected. So yes, the economy, national unity. I would imagine that the next president would try very hard to make a trip to Washington, D.C. to meet Trump because the economy so much hinges on the tariffs that are in place. This relates to industrial policy. South Korea has invested over $116 billion in the last 3 years. Do they want to continue investing in the U.S.? Can they continue to invest? It may make sense if there's all these tariffs on autos, on semiconductors, on batteries, on petrochemicals. But if there's uncertainty, or if Trump is saying, well, you should negotiate, or he says something else about the lines and burden sharing, or other deals need to be done, at some point you're just going to be tired of this, and you just say, we can't really trust the United States. And if Trump leaves and someone else is in office, what's going to happen next? But they won't know until they actually have a leader-to-leader meeting with Trump. So I think that will be on one of the high priorities for the next president. Now, whether they will get that meeting or how soon they can get that meeting, we'll have to see too, because I don't know how Trump will respond to South Korea. He hasn't really said all that much other than criticize South Korea for tariffs, or for the trade imbalance. But yeah, I'm not sure if Trump will feel that South Korea rises up to his priority level to give them a meeting right away.
Yeah, I mean, we saw like in the first Trump administration, there was a formula that every world leader pretty much understood, which was come to Washington, bring a lot of gifts, say a lot of nice things, and quietly seek some sort of tariff exemption or whatever it might be. The Japanese prime minister was the first in the building, did exactly that, pledged a big number of $1 trillion, right, in foreign direct investment. And what happened to Japan on Liberation Day, right? No exemption for them.
No exemptions.
24%. Yeah.
And so you probably heard this as well too, Victor, and also Darcie. When we get these Korean delegations, after Trump was elected, they talked about a big platter or a big plate. What are some things that we can offer the U.S.? How can we buy more American products, whether it's LNG, whether it's shipbuilding? So they're all trying to come up with a package. And the sad thing is, at the end of the day, maybe this won't matter at all. You'll still have these tariffs. Now, that's where I still think it's early enough in Trump 2.0 that maybe there is some room for negotiating, that you can carve out exemptions. But that's the strategy that the acting president had in place. Han Duck-soo has also said that he would continue that strategy when he was reinstated. But will the next president want to continue that? If it looks like even offering these concessions, offering this big plate of goodies to the U.S. doesn't really get you all that much in terms of having tariffs rolled back. Yeah. But again, that's something we'll have to see. The tariffs most of them don't go into effect until tomorrow. But we'll see what they look like 60 days from now.
Right, I agree. And 60 days from now, the United States is going to be feeling economic pain 60 days from now. Not just the Koreans or the Japanese, but the United States. And there'll probably be a lot of internal pressure on Trump to course adjust, right? And so it could work out, the optimistic scenario could work out that, having a White House meeting like about 3 months from now may actually be good timing because maybe that platter will give Trump something he needs and give him a good excuse for sort of taking some of the pressure off. We don't know. We don't know, but we never know. Yoojin, your thoughts on what the next South Korean president will have to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with both of them, and I think there are some observers seeing that we will have to see how U.S. Will feel the pain, and then maybe sort of rather than trying to really speed up with the negotiated settlement, maybe just maybe hold up this moment. But I mean, Korean media and Korean public, they always want a faster, quicker.
Koreans are not good at waiting for anything.
Yeah,
right?
so I doubt
right?
whether that strategy will work. And so I agree with their points. And on South Korea's political gridlock, I think it won't go away, even when Lee Jae-myung comes into power or the conservative comes into power. And it was, I guess, interesting to note that the Constitutional Court, when they gave a verdict yesterday, they actually said that both the president, former President Yoon, and the National Assembly, they had to sort of have a respect for each other. And the court also actually emphasized that Yoon should not have resorted to those abusing emergency powers, but also sort of, I guess it was a little bit of a compromise among liberal and conservative judges that this opposition-led legislature, they were creating and persisting the political gridlock, which was not, I guess, helpful for the country as a whole. But I don't know how much of that awareness will really be studied by politicians, and then that they change the course because it's just so ingrained, the polarization, just like in the U.S.
Yeah.
And I don't see that's gonna be any much improving in the short term and longer term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if we do have a progressive government in June, I mean, we will have a period of what, 2 years? Is it 2 years where you will have progressive government in YPO and progressive control of the legislature, right? And so there will be pressure on that incumbent government to like get some stuff done, right? Whereas it was really, as you said, gridlock for the past 2.5 years. Okay, let's end the show with one last question, which is one additional takeaway from each of you. In the past 5 months, we have seen the first martial law declaration in 4 years. We've seen the second South Korean president to leave office through impeachment, 2 acting presidents, an impeached acting president, his reinstatement, and just a lot, right? A lot of stuff going on. And so just reflecting on this, how do you think about, like, what's one thought you would give us to take us home in terms of how you think about this, how history will remember this particular moment? Yoojin, why don't we start with you?
So I think history may recount this period as, South Korean democracy, especially the 1987 regime, which was when we had the last constitutional amendment from decades of military rule that really underwent a severe stress test. And Korean democracy, as before, people power really saved itself from total destruction. But then at the same time, a lot of, I guess, questions have been raised about how to deal with this excessive presidential power, because it's not just the issue of some unfit, undemocratic leader abusing power, because it has been happening over and over again. So there needs to be some kind of, I guess, really efforts to try to ensure that presidential power not being abused, and maybe lay some foundations for constitutional reform at some point.
Okay, yeah. Andrew?
I mean, when the history books go back and look at this, I think the word that will come to mind is resilience. December 3rd, 2024, no one would have fathomed a declaration of martial law, but that the country was able to come out of that political crisis and have their democracy intact. I think that's what will be highlighted. But I also feel that this political roller coaster ride, it's not over, and I'm almost scared to see what's going to be the next thing that we see that we haven't imagined. You were listing martial law, 2 impeachments, possibly a third, and this is all unprecedented. But this isn't just in South Korea. I think we're seeing this politics worldwide, where things are becoming more extreme, more polarized. Certainly here in the United States, we're feeling that after our election, November 2024, in DC, mass layoffs and firing. So it's very, it feels very raw in some ways. But in Europe as well too, we're seeing polarization. We're seeing just politics becoming more politicized, and that's creating uncertainty. And so I do have some fear for what's going to come next in South Korean politics, even though I think the Korean people are resilient, and they certainly have resolved this chapter of the martial law crisis.
All right, yes. Darcie?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's been something that as a political scientist and as a journalist, we grapple with when we're talking about Korea's democratic resilience is it has these such robust democratic institutions, respect for rule of law. I mean, the glimmer of hope is that there was acceptance of the Constitutional Court decision, right? There wasn't violence afterward. That's really, I think, quite remarkable. But at the same time, the paradox of Korean democracy is that we have repeated abuses of power and corruption that has led to these impeachments over time. There's the fact that there's even an office of high corruption or corruption for high officials. Like that doesn't exist in every single country, right? That itself, I think, is a signal that this is a problem to the way that Korea's institutional design. And then I think the most remarkable thing about this is that while there was just such widespread pushback on the martial law declaration and civil society mobilization, the social cleavages and the polarization that is, I think Andrew insinuated before, it's probably even was worsened by this, is not going away. And that's also, I think, a factor that Korean democracy needs to deal with going forward. So those are, I think, the two things that as we think about this moment in Korean's democratic history, there's some really tough decisions that the Korean public as a whole needs to grapple with.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, all of you very perceptive. I mean, I think this is like we're clearly we're the crisis is not over, right? We've just moved from one stage to the next. I agree. I think the polarization is even deeper, and we'll see it play out in terms of over the next 2 months. But I leave struck with how these institutions are fairly resilient, like the electoral institution, the legal institution, fairly resilient. But but the political culture is not democratic. The political culture, as you say, when the people have power, they abuse it. But at the same time, there is such an egalitarian culture in Korea. Like nobody's better than anybody else. Like you may be richer than me, but you're not better than me. You may be more educated than me, but you're not better than me. And so that also creates this very strong sort of grassroots resistance to all this abuse of power. So, a lot, we've covered a lot in the last 45 minutes. I want to thank you all, Yoojin Kim, Andrew Yo, Darcie, Draudt-Véjares for joining us. Thank you all, our audience, for watching this episode of The Impossible State, and we look forward to seeing you on the next show.